But even from a static perspective, it's not obviously better if we have an increasing marginal and average cost curve. Yeah, Prashank.
Maybe I just don't understand this, but
Yeah.
can you give me some concrete examples of monopolies where marginal costs are greater?
Well, we're going to go through a particular case in a moment. Let me just show you a picture of what I was saying before. So let's first think about the comparison in the standard case of declining marginal costs. Then the social optimum would be where demand intersects marginal cost, right? The monopoly is where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, which is going to be way down here. And the competitive equilibrium is, or the average cost pricing, is where price is equal to demand. Price is equal to average cost, right? And average cost pricing will lead to a price that's in between these two extremes and will be better than monopoly, but not up to the social optimum. On the other hand, when you have marginal cost that's increasing, then the social optimum will be where marginal cost is equal to demand. The monopoly will be below that point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, right? But the competitive equilibrium will be too far on the opposite side, right? Average cost equals demand will have too high production when we have these increasing marginal and average cost curves. So monopoly or competition, either one could be better. So in this case, unregulated monopoly, average cost pricing, which one is better is ambiguous, because the social optimum is somewhere in between. OK. Now, Prashank wanted me to give an example. I'll give some more examples later. But in a classic industrial context, power generation, everyone thinks that as economies of scale, and it's probably sub-additive. But at some point, if you have one person looking after a whole power grid, right, eventually the marginal cost of producing power might well rise. And in fact, if you start, for example, if you have a supply of water in an area, right, and you use that to get hydroelectric power, at some point, as the quantity starts to increase, you're going to run out of your source of hydroelectric power and have to start buying gasoline. And once you've bought all the gasoline from the local area, you're going to have to start buying, more stuff. And that could very well make, even though it's probably more efficient just to have you as one firm, right, it could very well make your marginal cost increasing beyond some point, right? So I think it's actually quite common that you could end up in that type of a situation. So if you mandate average cost pricing, you could actually get overproduction, right? OK. So yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, back to that slide.
Yeah.
I cannot understand why if the marginal cost increases in this case, why do companies want to produce if without subsidies?
Because their average cost is below their marginal cost. They're still making profits, right? If I mandate here, I'm still making, I'm making zero profits here, right? But if I raise it even slightly,
Okay.
I'm just breaking even there, right? Yeah. Yeah, James.
Sorry, why have you called it adverse selection?
Oh, you'll see that in a second. I reordered these slides before I introduced the relationship to selection. You'll see that in just one moment. OK. So at least as important, I think, as these static distortions are the dynamic distortions created by regulation. So companies can easily affect their costs in many ways, right? They can make efforts to cut costs, cut workers that aren't necessary. They can innovate to create more productive processes. They can choose cheaper over more expensive inputs. And last year's problem set for the sort of mother course of this course had you look at some of those, had the students look at some of those effects. You can look back at those in the old problem sets folder. So unless all of these things can be controlled and monitored by the regulator, the problem with average cost pricing is firms aren't going to have any incentive to try to reduce their costs because they're not making profits either way, right? And in fact, if the regulator learns about your future costs from what you do this year, you might actually have an incentive to increase your costs. So this effect is called the Ratchet Effect, and whenever I think about it, I always think of a story my father told me. So he worked for a defense contractor, and they were going to the government, and he gave a proposal to the government, and he said, look, I can save you 50% of the cost of making this weapon system. You guys should really go with our proposal. And the general who was in charge of this said, sir, I would derelict my duty to my country if I spent 1 cent less than was budgeted for this project. And he said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, if we don't spend every penny of this budget, next year Congress will cut us down to that cost, and think of how that will destroy the defenses of this nation against the Soviet Union, right? And James, did you have a question about that? Oh, no. Yeah.
I have a follow-on question about the average cost pricing and incentives.
Okay. So other causes of average cost pricing are quite similar to this, right? So imagine that we have free entry, and that causes average cost pricing, right? Then firms are going to have very little incentive to innovate because they know that whatever they do is just going to have, is just going to be driven back down to average costs, right? And that's why we're going to talk about reasons why you might want to limit free entry to try to get away from this sort of thing, to move more back to a monopoly case and away from the average cost pricing. Yeah, James?
What if you, have people looked at the idea of using lagged average cost pricing as the payment system? Because that would give incentives for dynamic.
No, that's exactly the problem that was going on with my father's thing, right?
Okay, yes.
That's the problem, right? Yeah, Beichi.
So average cost pricing is going to happen in free entry because if there's profit, then firms are going to enter, right?
Exactly.
So, but doesn't that assume that whatever innovation you have is going to automatically be known by every other firm?
Yeah. So I mean, it's only if there's really free entry into doing exactly whatever you're doing. But anytime there is, you're going to have this sort of a problem. So anything that causes average cost pricing will create these types of dynamic incentive problems. Okay. Now getting back to James's question, why did I have this selection thing going on? Well, one important source of nonlinear costs is what's called selection. So first of all, imagine that a government, we're trying to think, what's the government's cost of providing insurance to the population, right? And let's let Q, the quantity, be the fraction of the population we provide insurance to, right? And P is the prevailing price for insurance, right? Now, costs for providing insurance are going to be nonlinear. Why? Because the people who are going to take up insurance are going to be different at different prices, right? In particular, imagine that the first people into the market are the most sick, right? The first people who want to buy insurance at any given price, the people who are willing to pay the most, are the most sick, which you might think would be the case because they're the ones who are planning to use that insurance the most, right? So in that case, which is usually called adverse selection, what are going to be the slope of the cost curve with respect to quantity? Chrissy?
Oh, like from the graph that we had earlier.
Yeah.
So you've got the cost curve undercutting, so they're both downward sloping.
Yeah. Why is the cost curve going to be downward sloping when the first people who are interested in getting into the market are the sickest?
Well, in the reading, when the costs are actually a function of the demand, so to the people who are selecting in, the cost is higher associated with people who are riskier, and then
Yeah.
if it's decreasing, it's people's riskier.
Well, because the people who are willing to pay the most, the first people into the market, right, are the sickest people. And so when the quantity is low, the costs are going to be high. As the quantity gets higher, the costs are going to be lower, right? And so the average cost curve, and therefore the marginal cost curve, are going to be declining, right? That's right. Okay. On the other hand, there can be what's called advantageous selection. And this might happen in an insurance market because imagine that the people who want insurance most are like really hypochondriacs. They're people who are like obsessed with their health, right? Then those people are probably going to take good care of their health as well and will be relatively cheap people to give insurance to, right? And then the first people into the market are going to be the healthiest people, right? The most hypochondriac people. If that's the case, what's going to be the slope of the cost curves, Eric?
They're increasing.
Yeah.
The first people in at low quantity and high price are going to be the people who probably least need insurance because they're risk averse.
Yeah. Exactly. So that will cause the marginal and the average cost curves to slope upward, right? This will be particularly important, say, if the poor or uneducated don't tend to get insurance, right? And of course, a mixture could happen over different ranges. There could be some adverse selection at one point, then advantageous selection, depending on the order in which people select into the market as the prices fall, right? Notice that this cost curve is the cost curve for the industry as a whole, right? Not for an individual insurer. Because if I'm just a tiny little insurer as part of a market, right, I'm basically going to get a representative sample of all the people who are in the market at that time. It's really the overall price that causes people to select into the market or not, right? But given that insurance is usually a social concern, we can sort of think of these things in the same terms. And because as an individual insurer, I just get a representative sample, the free entry logic that we talked about before is going to mean that every firm is going to charge a price that's equal to average cost, right? So we can therefore think of selection, adverse or advantageous, as really just being defined as the slope of the curves. There's adverse selection when the curves slope downward, and therefore there's a wedge between marginal and average cost, that average cost is greater than marginal cost. And there's advantageous selection if the marginal cost is above the average cost. Mohammed, do you have a question? Oh, no. OK. And this is exactly the way that Einov and co-authors in 2010 sought to measure the degree of adverse selection or advantageous selection. So they went to a large aluminum manufacturer that had two plants, that had two plans for insurance. One was like basically very little insurance, and another was a very generous insurance plan. And everyone in the company had to have one of these insurance plans by law. But individual plant managers were allowed to choose how much they wanted the extra payment to be to get the good plan over the bad plan, right? And they claim that this was basically random, how they decided to do this. Who knows whether you buy that assumption or not? You can read their justification of it. But imagine that it were, right? Then basically what we're getting is variation in price that will change the number of people who select in, and therefore the queue that we observe in different places. And that will let us trace out what the cost curves look like and determine the amount of adverse selection, right? So they measured the average costs of claims, average cost of coverage through the claims that people actually make in those markets, right? And this draws out their average cost curve. And of course, remember that the wedge between average and marginal cost is just given by the slope of the average cost curve. So once you've drawn out that average cost curve, you can just take its derivative, and then you can get the difference between the average and marginal cost curves. And that'll tell us the distortion that rises because of adverse selection, right? And this is exactly what they did. So each of these represents a different manager who charged a different price, right? And you can see a demand curve, which is that when the price was high, the quantity tended to be low. That's these white dots here, right? And you can draw a little linear demand curve through this. It actually looks a little bit more concave to me, but anyway, they did linear. And then you can draw out the average cost at each of these quantities.